to the second of 3 presentations on regulatory best practices. This one's on compliance monitoring, and the presentation is aimed for environmental ministries and environmental regulators around the world. So a little introduction to myself. My name's Simon Bingham. I've been a regulator for more than 30 years with permitting, inspection, specialist and managerial experience, developed regulatory systems, including risk and inspection frequency, which we'll talk about today. And I've worked internationally for over 19 years, working on capacity building and management consultancy type projects. So in that time, I've worked in over 15 countries on regulatory and environmental topics. So today we're looking at compliance assurance, in particular the compliance monitoring aspect of it. And if we look at a typical environmental regulatory organization, we'll find that they do a mix of compliance promotional, monitoring, and enforcement activities. But what we see at a country or a regional level is that you need a mix of players to do this, so that you'll find that there may perhaps be an agency that looks after industry, another one that looks after nature. It could be that certain elements are retained by ministry, and it requires all of these institutions to pull together to deliver compliance assurance. And it may even be that different elements of compliance monitoring happen in different institutions. So there's a large amount of sharing and cooperation that needs to happen between these institutions. And one of the failings that we see is that this sharing doesn't always happen. So as a resource that just came out from the OECD last year in 2023, it's a OECD recommendation of the Council on Environmental Compliance Assurance. So this talks to the 3 pillars that we've just mentioned, and the institutional arrangements as well. So all the OECD countries have actually signed up to this recommendation. It's something I personally would recommend to all countries. So in this presentation that's just solely on monitoring, we're going to look at 3 principal elements within that: the planning aspect and prioritization, an aspect that we're calling execution, so the doing the monitoring itself, and compliance assessment at the end, pulling it all together. So the first bit that we're going to look at is compliance planning. And this is a really important bit. So the reality of being a regulator nowadays is that we are stretched like butter over too much bread, as J.R.R. Tolkien said, and that was he's the writer of Lord of the Rings, and it's very true in terms of a regulator. We're trying to do more and more with limited resource. And what we find is that we tend to do more things poorly rather than focusing on doing certain things well. One of the things that is embedded in all of these presentations, particularly this one and the next one, is what I would call resource use principles. And there's 3 E's in English: effectively, efficiently, and economically. Which are used in all of this work. So from an effectively perspective, does the activity achieve the desired outcome? And if it isn't, then you're probably doing the wrong thing in the first place. Are you doing it efficiently? So are you achieving the maximum output you can with the minimum effort? And from an economic perspective, can you do the activity in a different manner for less? So it's something that we look at in all this discussion on compliance assurance. So in talking about planning, a good source of information is the Doing the Right Things methodology that was introduced by Impel over a decade ago. And it has a stepwise process. They call it the Ring of Eight, that looks at planning, execution, reporting, and evaluation. And in the square on the right, the box on the right, you can see that I've highlighted planning. And there's four principal elements to this: is describing the context, setting priorities, defining objectives and strategies, and planning and review. So this is a detailed stepwise methodology. You can see by the number of components how this highlights the importance of planning in the process. This is a weakness that we see in many organizations, that the planning process is either streamlined or almost missed altogether. And it's quite important. Well, it's very important to actually spend time on the planning process. So one of the first considerations when looking at prioritization is from a very strategic level. So we'll be looking at strategic, tactical, and operational levels. So from a strategic perspective, what are you actually trying to achieve as an environmental regulator? Malcolm Sparrow, who we quoted in the first presentation, has a little phrase that he uses called "pick important problems and fix them." So it's finding the most important things out there and focusing on them, and then doing something about them. So rather than focusing on everything, a bit like the butter on toast analogy, it's focusing on some of the bigger, most important issues first. So in terms of setting the baseline, the what that you're going to do, in effect, many regulators focus on the legal mandate. So what regimes do they have to inspect or take samples from? And that's their main focus. So if they've got large industrial sites and waste and sewage discharges, they will devise a list of all those activities, and then that will be their sole basis of their plan. One of the things that's often missed is the strategic objectives. So this could be the objectives of the government, the ministry, of the regulatory organization itself. Um, so instead of jumping straight to operational planning, is actually building those strategic elements in as well. At this stage, you'd also start to compile lists of be it protected areas, activities, or operators that you would need to regulate. And in that, you would build a register of these sites and operators so that you have a full list as possible. And this list will change over time. And the thing is that you need to frequently update this list. So we call this targeted freeloader campaigns. So freeloader is somebody who's carrying out an activity without a permit. So you'll be looking for those people without permits on a regular basis. The times when you know you're going to have to do this is when there's a legislative change. So when a threshold in a piece of legislation changes, or when there's a new piece of legislation. If you know you have a high sectoral or a high activity level of non-compliance, such in the diagram in terms of waste, in the picture in terms of waste collection, or if you've got intelligence telling you things are happening in particular sectors, which means that you should be looking into them. And in terms of frequency in which you should do these campaigns, they will be as often as necessary. So some, like legislative change, will be fixed, but others will be perhaps every year, every couple of years, depending on what your intelligence is telling you. So moving on to a tactical level, It's at this stage you're trying to understand your resource constraints. So how many inspectors, for instance, do you have? How many days do they have to do their work? How many inspections can they carry out in a year? You're looking at your technical capacities. So uh, are different inspectors able to inspect all regimes, or do you have to apply um, certain staff members to certain activities? You're looking at the actual regulatory tools and methodologies that you have with you. So there's different options in terms of monitoring, and we'll talk about that shortly. But you're trying to build this full picture of how you're going to deploy your resources most effectively to achieve your mandate and meet those strategic objectives. So one of the things that we've seen is that many regulators around the world will jump straight to site inspections, and that their focus will be doing as many site inspections as possible. Compliance monitoring isn't just about site inspection. There's four principal elements. There's the on-site inspection, desk-based inspections, sampling, and what I'm calling remote systems. So this is a newish development, and we'll talk about all of these. So in the EU, there's only 3 bits of regulation that stipulate you have to do an on-site inspection. That's the Industrial Emissions Directive, Seveso 3 Directive, and the Waste Shipment Regulations, looking at transfrontier shipment of waste. So the rest may say inspection, but inspection where it isn't specifically noted that it's a site inspection could fall under any of these 4 boxes. It's any kind of monitoring that helps show the level of compliance. So now looking at the operational side, we're looking at risk criteria and sorry, risk assessment process, and for a new site, this would happen after the permitting stage. So risk assessment for a new site could be done by the inspectors, but equally it could be done by the permitters in that first initial stage. Um, what you can see by this diagram is that it's a cyclical process, that once you've carried out your risk assessment, that will identify your compliance monitoring frequencies and tools that you're going to use. That, when it's all pulled together, will give you an assessment score, which will tell you if you need to do any non-compliance response like enforcement, or if there's any cleanup that needs to be done from a incident, what have you. But all of that feeds back into the risk assessment process and would need to be reviewed. So that review should be on an annual basis. And it's also worth saying that because the environment changes, because the strategic objectives change of various organizations, that risk assessment and risk criteria in particular should not be fixed. They're not fixed in stone or fixed in legislation. They should be changeable by the regulator who has that responsibility. So we're going to look at choice of criteria. So risk is the impact times the probability, and within assigning a score and then a frequency of inspections generally, there will be various criteria on which are scored. Something to say that it's fairly significant is that risk and the setting of inspection frequencies is not an exact science. And many organizations spend a lot of time on this process and either get an outcome that isn't particularly well differentiated, or it is so differentiated that it's almost meaningless. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So if you look at how you build your risk assessment, it's built on a set of criteria. The choice of those criteria is your own as a regulator. How you weight those individual criteria is your own. How many criteria you use is also your own choice. And each of those elements will change the score. And the change of score will have a direct impact on inspection frequency. So if you look at impact criteria, things like scale of activity, you could choose to have 3 levels or 5 levels of scale, scale of emissions, scale of waste produced. All of those sort of things will have an impact on the ultimate score. Probability is things like the frequency of operations, the seasonality of operations, and those will have a direct correlation on score as well. So when you pull them together, the choices you make at this stage will have an impact on what your inspection frequency will be and what sites you inspect more regularly than others. There is a guidance document on this, a risk criteria for the prioritization of environmental inspections. Again, it's an Impel document. Be able to find it on the website. But one of the things that I see often missed here in the choice of criteria is a link to the strategic objectives. So, for instance, if you had an objective set that you had to improve the water quality of a major river running through your country, if you didn't have a criteria that was directly aimed at 1, discharges to water, and 2, specifically on that river, you're unlikely to see inspections or inspections of a high enough frequency to have any impact on that strategic objective. So I think it's always bearing in mind what you have here. So also the inspection frequency is determined by how you score things and how you rate things. So in this first diagram, the probability and hazard matrix are green, being low impact. So 1-1 is low impact, low probability. 5-5 being high impact, high probability. But you can see impact is also called hazard, severity, or effect, and probability could be likelihood. Where you color those boxes, as it were, is up to you. And you will see that in some European states, they have very low numbers in high, and the vast majority in low. But that again is up to the organization setting the inspection frequency. So it'd be quite easy and realistic to move from a 4 level to a 3 level. So for instance, I said at the very beginning that I designed a scheme that had 7 different levels, but included everything from a refinery through to a petrol vapor recovery station at a petrol station. So it had and everything in between, like farms, radioactive sites, etc., etc. So it's really up to you. And even when there is a standard methodology, which Impel have designed, if you search for Easy Tools or IRAM on the Impel website, you'll pull up the integrated risk assessment method. It shows you a tool and a methodology that's used in organizations around Europe, Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Estonia, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Slovenia, and Turkey, to name a few. There's more than that. But because they choose their own risk criteria, their own weightings, their own frequency of inspections, what this sets is a consistent methodology, but not a uniform output. So this is one methodology. You will see other states and organizations use a very descriptive level, perhaps. It says something like sites falling under the Industrial Emissions Directive will get one inspection a year. Sites falling under their local waste management regulations get one every 3 years, or whatever. And then there's other organizations that have developed their own in-house system to do this. So as I said before, there's little point in spending lots and lots of time at this activity. You need to get to the output as quickly as possible. So finding a methodology that works for you based on what your mandate is and what strategic objectives you're trying to achieve. Keeping it flexible to allow you to change year in, year out as the environment changes, as objectives change, etc. So an example where IRM is used is in Slovenia, and the Slovenian Inspectorate of Environment and Energy use it for three different regimes. The Industrial Emissions Directive, Transfrontier Shipment of Waste, and Waste Management Activities. And they've been using it for, I think, a decade or more, and I know they find it very useful. So in the last presentation, we talked a bit about permitting and about resourcing, and this one is quite similar. So that when we look at the output from a environmental risk assessment process, we would expect to see fewer numbers of activities in high risk, more in medium, and the most in low. But the effort as a regulator we would expect to spend on those sites would be inversely proportionate. So we'd spend more time on high, less on medium, and the least on low, or that is certainly the idealized relationship. But actually, what we find in reality, similar to permitting, that we have this what I'm calling a salt shaker effect, that we actually spend a lot of time on high, a similar amount of time on medium, but a lot of time on low. And part of that is because there's actually such a high volume of low activities. And if we try and treat them in the same way that we would a high risk activity, we will spend a lot of time. So we'd spend a lot of time doing inspections if we're trying to look at everything equally. So what this means often in many countries is that there's not enough resource to carry out all those activities that fall under the high, medium, low. So cuts have to be made. And unfortunately, what we often see is that the cuts are made to the high activity sites. And the reason why we see this is that there's a limited number of sites that are getting a high amount of resource applied to them. And it's easier to either shave the amount of days that we do time on the inspection, or reduce the number of annual inspections, because that will save a significant amount of resource overall. That's not ideal. If you remember, the Malcolm Sparrow is find important things. The important things are those high risk activities. From a community society perspective, they want us to focus, or they would expect us to focus the most effort on those high risk activities. But strangely enough, we often reduce the amount of effort. So the aim is actually to reduce activities in the low risk. So I said that it's only 3 European pieces of regulation that actually require us to do site visits. That means there's other bits of regulation where we don't necessarily have to do a site visit. We could look at other methods of regulate them other than inspection, or we could look at the frequency of those, such that we actually reduce some of this effort. There's also looking at opportunities to use technology of which we can actually cut this effort down. So it's more like the idealized use of resource against risk. So the next topic we're going to look at is execution, the doing element, and we're going to look at all four elements: the on-site inspections, desk-based inspections, the sampling opportunities, and remote systems. So on-site inspections come in a variety of different methods and methodologies. So the first thing to talk about is the routine or planned inspections versus a reactive or unplanned inspection. What we would normally say is that states or regulators who are more reactive are less in control of their compliance. So they're just spending their time responding. So if you can spend more of your time doing routine activities, so you've planned your inspections, you have an inspection plan that you've set out at the beginning of the year, that has time built into it for the reactive or unplanned, but you're going through your sites that came out of your inspection frequency, your risk process, um, and you're spending more time on the routine, you're more in control. It's likely that the level of compliance is higher, and that it's having a more of a positive impact on the environment. The aim is to get somewhere between 60 and 70% routine. There is always going to be a requirement to be reactive, but looking at that 60 to 70% of work in the routine split is a good place to aim for. In terms of joint inspections, there's quite a few of the regulatory regimes, depending on how you're set up domestically. We'll see inspections by different regulators. So a good example is the Seveso 3 directive that looks at the potential for certain sites to cause large environmental incidents. They they are often regulated by environmental inspectors, by perhaps a health and safety inspector, by a civil contingencies inspector, etc., etc. I've seen in some countries that that directive's regulated by as many as 9 different regulators. So one of the things that I said at the beginning is about efficiency, effectiveness, and having a economically set mindset on this. There's also another element that comes into here, and that's all about reducing the administrative burden on those that we regulate. So if we have, I'll use that example of 9 different regulators visiting the same site, the ideal is to have them all visit on the same day, or perhaps on two days in different parts of the year, to limit the impact on those that we regulate, rather than have them go through exactly the same thing for 9 different regulators at 9 different times. So that joint inspections should be planned in advance. They should be in the inspection plan, and everybody should have their clear remit. There should be a joint inspection planning before that, so that each of the regulators know what they're going to be doing on that inspection. Within inspections itself, there's different ways that you can do it. So this could be site-based, but it could equally apply to some of the other examples. So a full audit inspection is going through every permit condition in depth, and going through all the records, spending lots of time on the site, and going through every element of what the permit says. A more nuanced approach is what we call a target approach, and that would generally focus either on the elements of highest risk. So, for instance, a waste incinerator would be air emissions and waste type, and how those two interact. So you can, in a targeted inspection, only look at certain elements, and there's very limited regulatory control in this that says you have to do a full audit every time. And what we see is that a permit, certainly for a large integrated site, will be very complex, many pages, maybe 100 sides or more, and we'll have a lot of information on. To do a full audit inspection on every inspection is perhaps unnecessary when you could be actually focusing on areas of highest risk. And especially in some countries where there is actually limited abatement on the highest risk activity within a site, the focus would naturally be on that rather than to find out some minor non-compliances elsewhere. So remember that the inspection is just one bit. You're actually trying to bring any non-compliances identified into compliance as soon as possible. It's not just about numbers here and how many site inspections you do. It's about the outcome that you achieve in your site inspections. And the next is what we call a sample. So for low risk activities, rather than inspect every low risk activity in a certain sector, it could be that you could take a sample and either have a random sample and only inspect, say, 5 out of 100 sites randomly to see their level of compliance. And whether you need to do any targeted interventions like educatory campaign or something like that. Or you could also look at this on a company level. So I mentioned petrol vapor recovery, and this is where at a petrol filling station, gas filling station, they recover the gas that comes off the fuel, and that will be either 2 stages into the tank when the mobile tank comes and fills up the petrol station, or through the nozzle of the gun that goes into your car. The risk from those is relatively low, and what you could choose to do is, because many of these stations are owned by the same companies, is to say choose 5 out of 100 of a particular company and see their level of compliance. So you just you're taking a sample rather than trying to go around every single activity. There's other opportunities here, and this is an example of good practice here in Scotland, where an organisation was set up called the Scottish Environment and Rural Services, or SEARS, and this brought together 8 partners, regulatory partners, national parks, who were working with people in rural communities, working with farmers, and it looked at ways to streamline activity. So in the earlier slide, I talked about joint inspections, and again, this is looking at elements of that. So the example here was the Scottish Environment Protection Agency and the Scottish Government Rural Payments Inspectorate that both carried out inspections on farms. The Rural Payments Inspectorate carries out a lot more inspections than the EPA. And one of the things that we had a problem with was that sheep dips, which have a herbicide to take off insects and ticks of sheep, have to be controlled in a certain way. So the EPA didn't have the resource to visit all these sites. So what they did was they trained the Rural Payments Inspectorate to do the inspections. So they carried out the inspections, and where they identified non-compliance, that information was passed back to the EPA to carry out any enforcement activity. It actually worked out that many more sites of non-compliance were identified and could be rectified sooner. So it's sharing that resource between organizations. So that very first slide about the different institutions, different regulatory institutions, and how we share capacity, knowledge, etc. is a good example of that. So on-site inspections, there's 4 principal stages. There's the pre-visit, the planning stage. There's the while on site, so that's the 2A and 2B in this diagram, the during inspection and inspection sign out. There's the reporting stage at the end of an inspection, passing on your findings, and then there's a review and planning so that you're prepared for the next visit. There's different elements of this that we see as issues in different organizations. So the first is the planning side of things. What we often find is that many inspectors don't leave enough time for planning. So identify what they're going to do on the inspection, look at previous reports, information, look at previous knowledge of incidents, look at previous compliance records, etc., etc. Having all that activity carried out pre-planning is pre-visit rather is really important. The second one, if we look at B, during the inspection, what we find out is that many countries are spending a large amount of time on site for their inspections. The norm in most of Western Europe would be 2 to 5 days for a relatively high risk site. They will go up at times, but it's certainly not much more than that for the vast majority of them. It's more likely that there will be multiple inspections in a year rather than any inspection of a significant length. If we look at C, best practice is if you leave the site without giving the inspection report, it's many countries actually give the inspection report while still out. But if you aren't doing that, good practice is to give verbal feedback about what you find, and that's partly because the actual process of reporting, if you don't do it on site, can actually take weeks and months. So the Industrial Emissions Directive has a limit in the directive of 2 months that feedback has to be, an inspection report has to be given to the operator within 2 months. It's also worth saying that this inspection report should be concise. You're trying to identify the principal areas of non-compliance and feed those back so that things can be rectified on the ground. In some large sites, the operators will have environmental professionals, but in many sites they won't, and the inspection report will just be one of many reports and pieces of legislation that they have to deal with. So having something concise is very important. Probably less than 10 pages would be ideal for the larger sites, and something of a low risk site, 1 2 sides max is probably the most appropriate. Yeah. So a couple of examples of good practice. So the Estonian State Environmental Board is a relatively new organization. It was formed by a merger of the board and the Estonian State Environmental Inspectorate. The inspectors are probably one of the most organized and well drilled inspectorate that I've seen. They utilize a lot of modern technology. They are very professional in the way that they carry out their work, and it will be a good model for many organizations to follow. So if we look at drones, in much of Europe, many regulators will have a drone, perhaps 1, 2, or 3 drones that they use, and they're looking for ways to use this drone. In Estonia, virtually every pair of inspectors will have a drone in the car, and at least one of them will be a qualified drone pilot. They use them routinely for investigations around pollution, enforcement, looking at sites. They use them probably on a daily basis if they can fly them. They're also quite good with mobile technology, so drafting their reports, inspection reports in the field, either using checklists on laptops or handheld tablets or some such. So here's another example of drone use. So this is Nature Scot. Nature Scot are the nature regulator in Scotland, and they look after habitats and birds directive. And you can see in the photograph on the left, it's a woodland next to a lake, and they are trying to do a count of deer in this woodland. And looking at that photograph, you can see how using conventional methodologies like inspection, it would be very, very difficult to actually count those deer. On the photograph on the right is a thermal imaging photograph, and I've put a ring on the 3 hotspots which show the deer on the ground. So you can see when you go back to the one on the left, it would be impossible to spot those. But using thermal imagery and new techniques, they can do activities that were virtually impossible to do before. This is another Scottish example, and this is how, if we look at those 3 E's, the efficiency and effectiveness and doing things economically, here's a good example. So there's 5 stages to this. It's looking at carrying out farm inspections based predominantly on impacts of diffuse pollution into watercourses. So the first stage is, of course, the pre-inspection planning, using evidence on water quality to find the most impacted rivers to target where you're going to go and do your inspections. Second stage is the inspection itself. So this is a walk around the farm inspection with a rugged waterproof tablet that is GPS and camera enabled. It's downloaded with a shared data set with maps from of every farm. It's a data set that's based on payments, so the names and addresses are quite current and up to date because farmers get their payments through this database. So all these maps of the farm boundaries, the fields, the location of the farms, the farmer itself are all on this handheld device. And they would go to carry out a farm, take photographs, press on a map where they found a non-compliance, and those GPSs and photographs would then automatically go into a system that would allow it to be reviewed once back in the office. And by pressing a button, it would automatically generate and send letters to the farmers. And this would also give information to a manager display unit, so you could look at how many sites have been inspected, how that's improved over time, etc., etc. So one of the things here to say, other than the use of technology and shared data set, is by making the process largely automated, the generation of feedback and the filing, there were massive savings in back office staff. So as this was a new activity, it meant that we could do the activity without recruiting an extra 20 staff to do largely administrative tasks. So if you notice the square in the top right has changed, we've moved on to the desk-based inspections. And these are equally as valid as site-based. You're looking at different elements, but they still, when they're pulled together, are elements that will give you an assessment of the level of compliance or otherwise. So the first thing that we look at is technical reports. And these will largely be driven by what's in the permit, whether there's a requirement to show the efficacy of a particular piece of system, so how certain sensors are working or how abatement is working. There could be a requirement to generate a report on that by the operator. It could be how they intend to carry out future developments, how they're going to expand their business. It could be about how they plan to carry out startup activities or close down activities and what the results of those we're finding, or it could be a descriptive a description of the level of compliance for things like habitats or birds directives or anything. So these technical reports will be many and varied. They will range in size and in detail, but their assessment will lead to an understanding of the level of compliance of that particular activity. So they shouldn't be forgotten. The more usual desk-based inspections are around operator data returns. And these are lists of emission data or waste production data or activities in habitat areas that operators are carrying out, and that they would feed back to the regulator on a quarterly or annually basis. And the first thing to say about these data returns is, if you don't need them, don't ask for them. So there should be a clear need of why we require operators to generate and send us this data. So if we go back to the institutional aspects of compliance assurance, it's about not putting undue, unnecessarily administrative burden on those that we regulate. So we've asked for this data. It's come into us as a regulator. Next, we should do something with them. So that means we as regulators need to assess this data. We need to have a mechanism. We need to have staff to actually do this assessment. I think actually allowing them to come in and doing nothing with them is probably worse than not asking for any at all. What we're seeing now is the development of many automated systems, so web portals that allow data submission from the operator and equally sharing between regulators. The biggest in Europe is probably sharing with the European Environment Agency, where data is sent to them. Automated systems that allow data checking. So you can have systems that check for outliers. You can have systems that check for things like compliance with Benford's law. Lots of different means that you can try and look to see if this data was generated by a human filling in the activity, or if it's been produced by a system. And importantly now is the increase in visualization of the outputs. There's many many of these systems, web-based systems that can be bought off the shelf, something like a Spotfire device that allows you to see graphs, bar charts, to see data added up, to see it averaged, to see various things with this data and be able to visualize it in different ways. Very useful for lots of different people in the regulatory organization, from inspector all the way through to policy level. Here's an example from Iceland, where they are extremely good at making their compliance data publicly available. So they have permits, they have simplified explanation of the activity that goes on the site. They have inspection reports. They also have the copies of operator annual returns on the website for the sites, which is very good practice. And they have deviation or follow-up on non-compliance inspection forms as well. Something that I don't know of anywhere else is actually showing the certification of the site as well. So the ISO 9001, 14001, etc. So Home Fist of None is the Icelandic Environment Agency. They do have some of their website in English, but this bit is in Icelandic only. So the next bit that we're going to look at is sampling, laboratory and field-based. So every environmental regulatory system should have access to sampling capacity, be it their own laboratories and field-based equipment, be it the laboratories of another organization, or a central laboratory for the state. Laboratories and the equipment that we're talking about is very expensive. So from a economic perspective, you've got to have the volume of activities, so the samples, to make it worthwhile. So I know certainly in some countries you see that every institute wants to have their own laboratory, when actually it probably makes sense to share laboratories around several regulators. So what we're looking at here is chemical analysis. The vast majority chemical samples will be water, inorganic, organic, looking at emissions to air, and measuring of waste. And this could include also modeling, looking at quantities of waste, as well as actual what's in the waste itself. And most laboratories will set up to work on high volume routine samples, such as ammonia, suspended solids. But what we're increasingly seeing is that they will have the capability to look at the stacks, the chimneys from large industrial sites. They might have specialist equipment, or be able to call upon specialists to actually carry out sampling directly from stacks and chimneys. Many organizations will also have mobile responses, so that they can take a mobile unit into the field to carry out real-time local water or air quality monitoring. Very useful in an environmental event. And the last in this category is the static monitoring. So this is frequently the airborne monitoring around cities, roads, factories that will pick up things like PM10, etc., PM5. Many sampling laboratories will also have a biological element to them, looking at things like microbial for measurement of impacts on bathing beaches or things like that. But we're also seeing a rise of the use of environmental DNA, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The capability to carry out ecological surveys is important, not just for those looking after habitats and birds directive sites, but also those trying to comply with the Water Framework Directive. So having surveys of aquatic, benthic, so underneath things like fish cages, habitat, fish, invertebrates, reptiles, mammals, etc., is all important. So actually having people that can carry out those surveys, be they either employees or be they outsourced to organizations that can carry out that work is important. So in the UK, there's several of the Environment Protection Agencies now use environmental DNA. So environmental DNA is it's a non-invasive approach to study biodiversity. In the past, if we were sampling fish or invertebrates, we would do something like electrofishing for fish, which could harm and kill fish, or we would be doing kick sampling for invertebrates. What eDNA does is it looks at the DNA in the water column. So in a sample of water that has come from the fish or the invertebrates. So each fish, as it swims through the water, will for instance, shed skin, and that goes into the DNA. So what you can do now is at the end of a lake or in a river, you can take a single sample of water and run it through a DNA profile, and actually it can tell you every fish species that's in that water body or every invertebrate species that's in the water body, and that is it's very efficient, and as I said, it doesn't have a negative impact on the species that you're sampling. Remote monitoring. So this is the last of the four elements in monitoring. So this is the area that we're seeing the biggest amount of development. There's huge technological advancements, and we're seeing changes almost in a daily basis. We're seeing technology having much more accuracy than ever before. The connections through telephone networks and 5G are meaning that systems have a much higher level of connectivity. They're coming down in price, so they're affordable. And these systems are giving us an enhanced compliance oversight. They're allowing us to do things that we couldn't do before. So going back to the butter on bread, this is allowing us to be in places that we couldn't go to before. It's also allowing cost savings, so where we may have to invest up front, but it does give us a saving over a longer time, so we can focus on other activities. And there is now a potential for real-time oversight of some of these sites, so we can be there 24/7, 365, not necessarily in person, but using some of this technology. And there is a very high connectivity to the three E's that we mentioned before: the effectively, efficiently, and economically. And that's part of why I think people are moving into this area. So I've got some examples for you. These are static monitoring sites. So in the Netherlands, there are 29 regional environmental protection agencies that cover the whole of the Netherlands, and some of those have developed the use of electronic noses around refineries, and some are around other elements like steelworks, etc. So the biggest example of this is around Rotterdam Harbour, where I think there's about 14 refineries, and there is a ring of about 250 of these electronic noses around these refineries. So each nose is a series of sensors, normally about 4 meters off the ground, that link into a control center, and they can tell when certain chemicals are detected via these e-noses, and sometimes the control center can let the refinery know there's a problem before even the refinery knows it has a problem. So I think it's very useful. And the other example here is in Romania. The Romanian National Environmental Guard have a series of in-stream chemical monitors on the Danube, and these are floating in the Danube Channel, and they can tell when there is pollution from one of the upstream countries or from domestic pollution. So when they go off again, they know that they've got a problem, so they go out and look to see what it is so they can stop it. This next one's an example of monitoring by satellite. So SUKA, the Finnish Environmental Institute, are required through the Water Framework Directive to look at nutrient status of over 10,000 remote lakes. Many of these will be very difficult access, scattered all around Finland, and it would take a lot of resource to physically go and sample each lake. So one of the things that it developed was a methodology in which they could look at chlorophyll, and by that nutrients of each of the lakes by satellite, and they can do that now on a regular basis. This one's an example of continuous monitoring. So you would expect most large sites, so the large combustion, the incinerators, the refinery, to have continuous monitoring in them. There's nothing unusual about that. What's unusual about this system is the law requires those sites to give access to the regulators. So it's a remote dial-in of the regulators into the site's own data real time. So in Spain, it's a 10-second data acquisition. So it's updated every 10 seconds of various emissions. And it's also corrected as well to the oxygen content. So they can see in the real time what is coming out of the stacks and chimneys. Italy have a similar system that again is embedded in law, which means that the regulator could be on a train to a meeting and could dial in. They could be sitting in the office. They could be at home and dial in and see what is going on those sites. So this next example is another one from Nature Scott. They're using artificial intelligence to count deer. I showed you the example they were using infrared, but this is for much bigger scale. In Scotland, often get cloudy, bad weather days, so the chances of doing things by satellite are quite low. So they use light aircraft to fly beneath the clouds and use these photographs to count deer by artificial intelligence. And if you look at the little box, this is the output. They get a little blue square around each of the deer that they identify. The bigger photograph is the same photograph, but I've colored each blue square in with a yellow dot so you can see what they are. And if I tell you there's 160 deer in that photograph, which is probably something like a square kilometer or less, actually counting them by hand or counting them in the field would be very difficult. And having the computer do it is much more a much better use of time, and it can also tell the difference between stags, the males, hinds, females, and the young, the calves, all by AI. So it gives you a much more accurate count, and from a resource perspective, you can cover large areas very, very quickly. So the last of three topics here is compliance assessment, and this is pulling it all together. So there's various elements to this. We've looked at the 4 components of site-based, desk-based, sampling, and remote monitoring. All of those have an impact on your compliance assessment. And it requires those institutions that have been involved in this to pull it together. It requires perhaps a multi-agency approach to either coordinate data. So if the permitting authority is doing the assessment, it requires the inspector to give data to the permitting authority. It could be that the assessment is done by, instead of just one regulator, by multi regulators. And again, that requires a coordinated approach. So having this in a disjointed manner is not helpful. It's not helpful for the regulator. It's not helpful for the wider community. And it's certainly not helpful for the operator. So actually having that coordinated view is very important. And within this is also the link into environmental incidents and complaints. Not just the routine activities, but all of those other things that happen outside of the plan have an impact on the assessment of compliance. And there's certain expectations that regulators have the capacity to do 24/7, 365 mechanisms for reporting, things like telephone, hotlines, websites, etc. That there's also a 24/7, 365 ability to respond to reports of serious pollution or non-compliance. Notice I said serious. It's not an expectation that an inspector or officer would go out to every minor non-compliance. It has to be triaged, but it's also an expectation that you would be there to stop significant pollution if it's going on, and also collect evidence for enforcement. So there is an expectation that these exist within the environmental regulatory, if not a single institution, that there is a mechanism within the wider capacity of a state to allow this. And here's an example from Ireland of an app that is used for just such reporting. It's called See It, Say It. It's available for all smartphones, regardless of type. And it's based on sending a photograph with a GPS stamp of what a member of the public has seen, be it pollution or destruction of habitat or fly tipping or something like that. So it's been going again for a number of years, and I think it's quite valuable. So part of compliance monitoring is uh, adopting what we do based on regulatory priorities. So that's part of the planning stage that we talked about earlier, but also adapting based on the behaviors of the regulated community. Um, this EU infograph shows a range of behaviors from the good on the left, the champions and the compliant, to bad on the right, contemptuous and criminal. And the way that we deal with each of these behaviors will require to be varied. Uh, so once we talk about enforcement, actually seeing certain tools used for criminals would not be appropriate for using the same tools on someone who was compliant. And equally, giving a small administrative fine to a criminal would uh, would be pointless. From an assessment process, we realized that the biggest impact is going to be on the confused and careless uh, rather than the opportunistic or contemptuous. Um, but I think there's merit in still making data on all of these available to the general public, carrying out that assessment and actually using the results of that assessment to do something. So the compliance assessment is just the scoring, if you like, of all those activities. So the inspections, the sampling from sites, um, the review of the data returns, the etc. All of that will give you a compliance score, whether this site is compliant, whether they're a champion, whether they're not compliant. You will know from what they're doing whether those activities are criminal or not. That is just the start of the process. You then have to identify how you're going to bring those sites into compliance if they're non-compliant. So what are the follow-up actions? Do you need to do more inspections? Do you need to work with different regulatory agencies to pull them into compliance? Do you need to do enforcement work? That all comes up at that stage. It also, if you remember, is a cyclical process. So this tells you whether you need to change your risk assessment for the site or the activity. Do you actually need to do more inspections next year? For a non-compliant industrial emissions directive site, there is a requirement where there's any significant non-compliance to do a follow-up within 6 months. And I think that should be the norm really for where we identify non-compliance, that we're actually doing something about it. Many organizations are now publishing the compliance assessment data, so putting it out into the public domain. And this has two main impacts. So it rewards those that are complying and going above compliance, and name and fame. But it also helps deter non-compliance in a name and fame way. So both of these are relatively easy to do just by publishing the data that you already have. And what I'm going to show you now is three examples. They're all from the Irish EPA, who are probably leading the field at the moment in terms of publishing their assessment data and what they do with it. So this first one is what they call a national priority sites. And it's very much about name and shame, and they use it to direct more resource to these sites. There's the potential that they can charge more for these sites if you become a national priority as well. And this list is updated every quarter. It's based on the results of inspections, complaints, and incidents. And each of these is scored. So if you have lots of non-compliances, lots of environmental incidents, you will score higher. And once you reach a threshold, you will become a national priority site. It's not necessarily top three. I think in this quarter there's only three, but it could be however many sites that go over that list. And people do not want to be on this list. It is something they will actively, once they get onto this list, they will be trying to comply as soon as possible to get off it. So it's not necessary for criminals that are perhaps they don't really care. This is for the sort of wider regulated sectors that have non-compliances. This next example is quite unusual, but it's worth sharing. With the institutional aspects of compliance assurance, there's a requirement of states to look at multi-level governance and build capacity across all institutions. In this example, the Irish EPA is responsible for assessing local authorities that also carry out regulatory duties. So this is a meta compliance assessment, as you will. It's done on an annual basis, and it lists all the local authorities from best to worst. And there are, I'm told, many of them who are trying to move up that list, and it's a tool to help drive behaviors. So this last example before we close this presentation is an example of the level of information that the Irish EPA provides on an individual site level of all the sites that they regulate. It gives various details of every site. And if you noticed on the box on the left, it'll say latest compliance records down on the left. And this will give you information about incidences that have occurred on that site. And if you click on the reference number, it will then pop up another box and give you more information about what the issue is and what's happening at the moment. And this is probably one of the best examples I've seen of this type of provision of information. And that's me. That's this presentation. Thank you for staying till the end. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this useful. And please note, if you haven't found the other two presentations, they're also available in this series. Thank you. That's me.